So, we live in a world that is obsessed with health. At least I would say so. And it's not really about life, it's not really about living. It's about health. Numbers on a chart, calorie counts, steps measured, cholesterol levels, therapy hours, wellness routines. So the body is reduced to metrics and the mind is reduced to diagnosis. Health is sold to us as freedom as well, but it often feels more like a prison. A prison decorated with yoga mats and supplements and gym memberships and green juices and antidepressants and Fitbits. So it's kind of like a prison where the fear of death is disguised as self-care. And there's the paradox, because the moment you are sick and injured and disabled and fat and depressed and aging, then suddenly your body isn't just yours anymore. Now it belongs to the gaze of others. The doctor, the state, the wellness influencer, the stranger who says, have you tried this? Have you tried this? Have you tried this? The sick body becomes a public project and a cautionary tale and a fetish object, or a category. Historically, whole groups were made into medical categories. Non-white people described as dirty, irrational, less evolved. Women pathologized as hysterical, reduced to sexual reproductive organs. And, fatness coded as moral weakness or sickness incarnate. Some bodies are valued and others are written off as defective, and people tend to talk about this as if this is in the name of health. But what if that's bullshit? Not all of it, but a lot of it. What if pain and limitation and illness, instead of being something to erase, actually could do something for us? What if confronting fragility and the potential of decay, or the certainty of decay, could transform the way that we relate to ourselves and to others? This is something that is practiced in other cultures all the time. But Western society wants us to run away from that pain and to drown it in coping mechanisms and distraction and productivity. But Makštena cuts right through that. He doesn't offer us the fantasy of the healthy subject or the perfect body. He offers us something much more raw, more unsettling, the chance to strip away the spook of health and to look at ourselves honestly and to build relationships that are grounded not in ideals but in vulnerability. Because maybe it's there in the limits and in the cracks and in the parts of ourselves that we're told to hide that something deeper can actually begin to emerge. It's a totally different way of looking at it. It's an argument that is not often made. So right now, I want to go into the spook of health. So let's start here. In modern society, this is what I'm going to say. Health is not about living. It's about performing. Health is the glowing skin on Instagram, right? The step count on your smartwatch, the mental health day you post about on LinkedIn or whatever, the meal plan with quinoa and kale, okay? Although quinoa and kale are really fucking delicious, but whatever. Health has become a brand. And like any brand, it comes with rules and hierarchies and exclusions. So we think of health as neutral. Who wouldn't want to be healthy? I mean, everybody wants to be healthy. It feels good to be healthy, right? But the truth is, health is one of the most powerful spooks in modern life, if it is extended to an ideal, because it doesn't shape how we actually interact with our own bodies, how we treat our own bodies. It shapes how we value people, how we police difference, and how we imagine life itself. And this is something that we often don't see when we think about health. So I want to start by thinking about health as control. So modern health is an industry, and through that, it's a system of control. So you step into a hospital. You're not just entering a space of healing. You're entering a system of measurement, surveillance, normalization. So your body is tested, categorized, and entered into databases. Blood pressure, cholesterol, body mass index, mental health screenings, all turned into numbers that define your worth. Michel Foucault called this biopower. The way modern states regulate life, not by overt violence, but by managing populations. So health is perfect for this because it gets under our skin, literally. It teaches us to discipline ourselves, to eat the right foods, to take the right pills, to show up for work on time, to keep your anxiety at bay so you can function. And mental health, too, has been captured by this logic. Look, I know that you guys sometimes have a problem with how I feel about like modern psychology. I do think therapy can help, okay? I'm not against therapy, and I think medication can most definitely save lives, okay? And I'm definitely not some anti-vaxxer, okay? I just do whatever you think is best. But mental health awareness often means productivity management. So are you depressed? Here are the tools to get you back to work, okay? Are you burnt out? Try mindfulness before your next shift. Okay, are you anxious? Journal about gratitude so you can get through Monday. Like, these are things that we're constantly seeing, and that is promoted in workplaces, at doctors' offices, and so forth. So health in modern society is less about your well-being and more about your functionality. A healthy worker is a productive worker. A healthy citizen is an obedient citizen. And I think we can't talk about any of this if we don't acknowledge the more fundamental obsession that we are trying to kind of absurdly prevent with this behavior, with this focus, which is death. So health has become our culture's strategy for denying mortality. So every routine, every supplement, every therapy is about pushing death further away. The body becomes like a fortress to defend, right? The mind becomes software to optimize. And aging itself becomes a disease that we're told we can reverse. Look at like Silicon Valley. Look at what they're obsessed with. Billionaires are massively obsessed. They're holding whole conferences about this shit when it comes to like longevity research, blood transfusions, cryogenics, biohacking, okay? It's not really about health. It's about immortality. It's about the fear of death. But death is not a bug in the system. It is the system. It's an inevitability since the beginning. Since the moment that you're born, you're in the process of dying. So pain, illness, mortality, these are not mistakes in the human design. They are human existence itself. So that's another way to look at it. Nietzsche wrote about this. He once wrote, "What if pleasure and displeasure were so tied together that whoever wants as much as possible of one must also have as much as possible of the other?" But modern society refuses this. It wants pleasure without pain, life without death. So health becomes the fantasy that we can outrun death. And so much of our ideals are based around this absurdity. But how are bodies policed in modern society? How are they monitored? How does this system work? How are they making it happen? Well, the spook of health wouldn't be so powerful if it weren't also a tool for sorting people. So modern society polices bodies through the language of health. Language, symbolism. So let's look at race. Modern medicine is built on colonial categories, straight up. Frantz Fanon showed how black bodies were constructed as diseased and dirty and subhuman. Even today, racial bias still persists in this way because black patients are less likely, statistically, to have their pain taken seriously and less likely to receive certain treatments and more likely to be blamed for illness. So health here isn't neutral, it's racialized. Then we have things like fatness. Okay, so the fat body is pathologized as a health crisis in itself, right? There's all these videos about the obesity epidemic, right? So there's like this moral panic about it. And, also like, oh, why am I paying taxes to support fat people or like to buy fat people unhealthy food, whatever. So fatness is coded as laziness and a burden and weakness and irresponsibility. But the cures, like these fad diets and surgeries and pharmaceuticals and what is that new shit called? Ozempic. They are literally billion-dollar industries, So health discourse both stigmatizes fat bodies and profits from them. So we have a huge, massive contradiction here. But health is not just about control. It's also about visibility. We can go back to, race and fatness here as well. It's about who gets seen and how they are seen. So fat bodies are hyper visible, right? So a fat person eating in public or just existing online becomes a target, and their body is treated as a spectacle and a warning sign. And meanwhile, people with invisible illnesses like chronic pain and autoimmune condition and mental illness are often just, dismissed. You don't look sick. You don't look sick. Why should I help you? You don't look sick. You don't need to go to the doctor. There's nothing wrong with you. You're young. You're skinny. You look athletic. It doesn't matter that you got a fucking tumor in your liver, Because in modern society, health is judged first by sight. And this links directly to sexuality as well. So health is bound up with desirability. So like fat people are marked not only as unhealthy, but also as less sexually valuable. So meanwhile, someone who is anorexic or, not extremely anorexic, but like still going through a process of starving and struggling and in danger can be read as disciplined and beautiful and desirable because of beauty standards, at least until it crosses a certain extreme. So thinness, even when it's killing you, is closer to health in our culture than fatness ever is. So this shows the spook in action. It shows the absurdity of it. What looks healthy matters more than what actually is, right? So health is filtered through beauty standards and productivity and responsibility and sex. But we also have to talk about gender and sexuality. Because historically, women were reduced to wombs, right? Diagnosed with hysteria, dismissed as irrational, and told to just, take this toy and, give yourself an orgasm and your life will be better. Or, there was a time when doctors were like, oh, you just need to let me have sex with you, then you'll be better, you know what I mean? But even now, women's pain is minimized. Endometriosis, for example, is completely ignored. There's hardly any research done on it. Menopause is, only recently medicalized. Queer people have been pathologized, right? Homosexuality was a mental illness in the DSM until 1973, okay? Healthy sexuality still defaults to his heterosexuality and reproduction. And we should look also at disability. So disability is framed as tragedy, right? Dependence, failure. Disabled people are erased from public life, or they're fetishized as inspirational. So, buildings, workplaces, public spaces still to this day often exclude them and then blame them for being abnormal in a sense, right? Health becomes the line dividing those who belong and those who are disposable. But disability is not an exception. It's the human condition. So if you live long enough, you will encounter disability through illness, aging, injury, whatever. The fantasy of perfect health survives only by denying this fact. And this shows you how delusional our culture really is. Then let's talk about addiction. Addiction is one of the clearest examples of health as a moralized control mechanism. Because people self-medicate. They self-medicate to cope with trauma and stress and alienation. And this often starts in childhood. So it's not even like their brains aren't even fully developed. They can't even make these choices themselves. but they end up in a position where they are addicted and then they get punished for it. So society floods us with substances, right? Alcohol, caffeine, prescription drugs, nicotine, TikTok, okay? But if your coping doesn't align with the health industry, then you're labeled an addict. And you know what? These people are the most cast out and considered deviant of anyone on this entire planet. So a glass of wine is social, right? An antidepressant is medical. But anything in terms of self-medication is criminal. And the line isn't biology, it's profit. Addiction exposes this hypocrisy of modern health. And that's why people are cast out. Because dependence is allowed only when it serves the system. So in all these cases, health is not neutral, it's a weapon. Some bodies are celebrated as fit and desirable, and others are stigmatized, fetishized, and erased. And modern society is structured to keep this hierarchy intact. But let's talk about fetishization, because it's particularly disgusting. It's not just rejection, it's consumption. So fat bodies, for example, this is a great example, become fetish categories on porn sites. Black bodies are hypersexualized all over the place, while simultaneously pathologized as dangerous. Disabled bodies become inspiration porn. Addiction becomes entertainment in TV dramas and clickbait headlines. Health discourse creates the very categories that it claims to cure. Do you see this? And then what it does is it commodifies them. It stigmatizes difference while selling it back to us as spectacle. And meanwhile, the health industry grows richer. Wellness apps, supplements, fitness influencers, pharmaceutical giants. So in modern society, health isn't just an ideal. It's a market. And you know me, I'm going to bring Stena into this. Stena's point is not about health. He doesn't directly talk about it. He talks about ideals, right? But Stena's point in terms of ideals is simple, okay? Whenever an idea becomes sacred, it ceases to be ours. Health is one of those sacred ideas. The moment that health becomes an ideal, it stops being about your body and your use of it. It becomes about serving a higher code. The state, the market, the family, the moral code, whatever. Stena would say, don't ask, am I healthy? Ask, is this body mine? Is this pain mine? Do I live in a way that is my own? So health is not good or bad in itself. Sickness is not good or bad in itself. What matters is ownership. So your pain is yours. Your limits are yours. Your pleasures are yours. And your desires to be whatever the fuck body you want to be is yours. So by breaking the spook of health, Stena doesn't tell us to reject medicine or therapy or fitness or any of that. Okay, this is not about morality. He tells us to stop bowing before ideals, to treat them as tools, nothing more and nothing less. But there's an unsettling thing here too. Because I think the thing that most people are afraid of is that if they give up the health ideal, then what they're left with is vulnerability, fragility, dependence, and mortality. And this is precisely what modern society, especially patriarchy, can't tolerate. Patriarchy builds itself on control and strength and invulnerability. So to be dependent is coded as weak and feminine and undesirable. To be fragile is to lose value. But what if fragility is not the enemy? What if vulnerability is the ground for authenticity? And this is something that Stena shows us. Stena shows that owning ourselves means owning our weaknesses as well as our strengths. That being honest with our limits is more radical than chasing the illusion of perfect health. And I think what that is, and I'm gonna get criticized for this, but I think what that is empathy, relation, and connection. And this is harshly controlled through the patriarchal system that we have set up in this world. Because let's be real, society doesn't want that. So it floods us with coping mechanism. It tries to distract us. It tries to make us think maybe there's a tiny fucking chance that you're able to just like magically not die. So wellness culture, gym culture, productivity hacks, self-care routines that become just another form of labor, TikToks about manifesting health. None of these are inherently bad, okay? I'm not trying to talk shit. Like, I do probably half of those, okay? I have a self-care routine. I do mindfulness. I use therapy speak all the time with my fucking boyfriend, okay? The problem is that these things keep us circling the same drain. They keep us busy, coping, distracted, instead of confronting the real. And the real is that life is fragile and that pain is inevitable and that death is coming. And all I want to think about is if maybe there's something in that, maybe there's something in that understanding that can actually help us. So modern society is built to keep us from looking too closely at this. It keeps us socially medicated in a sense. It keeps us occupied. It keeps us entertained. It tells us we can optimize our way out of the human condition. So, let me summarize. Here's the spook of health in modern society, in my opinion. It's not just the pursuit of wellness. It's the idolization of health as the ultimate good. It's the way health becomes morality, industry, and weapon. And it's the fantasy of life without limits. And I think the reason why Stena is so important to me in every aspect of everything at all times is because Stena cracks shit open. He reminds us that ideals, in this case health, only has power when we bow to it. When we stop serving it, it becomes just another tool and something we can use and discard and transform. We can understand it to be able to use it in the way that we want in connection with ourselves, our minds, our bodies. So to live in ownness is not to chase health, but to own your body as it is. To own your pain, your vulnerability, your mortality, and to say that this body is my body, this weakness is my weakness. So even my death belongs to me. And from there, from that like space of brutal honesty, there's a new kind of life that can begin. But let's move on and look at how any of this started, and let's look at the deep implications of the spook of health. So now that we've exposed health as one of the strongest spooks in modern society, let's try to dig deeper a little bit. How did health become an ideal in the first place? How did it turn from a lived experience of the body into an industry, into a morality, and into a hierarchy of human value? So in pre-modern societies, health was not an ideal. It was a matter of survival. So you got sick, you either healed or you didn't. Communities often held healing practices as rituals, not as universal scientific standards. But with the rise of modernity, something kind of shifted. So health became measurable, became part of the project of rationalizing life. So statistics, averages, categories, like suddenly the body was something to be normalized. The invention of the normal body, quote unquote, is actually very crucial here. Leonard Davis, in his book Enforcing Normalcy, shows that the concept of normal, quote unquote, only emerges in the 19th century, and it's tied to statistics and industrial society. So once there was a normal, quote unquote, everything else could be labeled as deviation, pathology, and sickness. And once you have deviation, you can build industries around it, right? Treatments, cures, corrections. So in this way, health becomes not just the absence of illness, but the pursuit of normality. Frantz Fanon wrote about this in Black Skin, White Masks. He talked about how colonial medicine racialized black bodies as dirty and diseased and animalistic. And the colonizer cast himself as like the healthy, rational, disciplined subject, while the colonized was pathologized as sick, irrational, and degenerate. And this wasn't accidental, okay? It was a justification for domination. So if colonized peoples were unhealthy, then colonial control could be reframed as treatment. The violence of empire could masquerade as healing. The author Achille Mbembe takes this really far in his book Necropolitics. So he says that health becomes a way of deciding who gets to live and who is left to die. So vaccination, sanitation, medical care, they are given to populations and they are withheld from other populations. And health, therefore, becomes like a geopolitical weapon. Even today, this legacy still persists because non-white people receive worse care. There's so much statistical data to back this up. These people are less likely to be believed and more likely to be blamed for their illnesses. Okay, so the spook of health disguises structural racism as individual pathology. This is very similar for women, sexuality, and in terms of reproduction. So health became a way of controlling women's bodies. In the 19th century, hysteria was a catch-all diagnosis for women who didn't conform. Okay, so if you're emotional, you're hysterical. If you're sexual, you're hysterical. If you're disobedient, you're hysterical. So women's reproductive systems were medicalized and their autonomy was reduced to, honestly, their breeding capacity. And even today, this pain, women's pain, is dismissed. Okay, so endometriosis is a good example. It takes an average of 8 years to diagnose. Menopause was only recently treated as a legitimate medical field at all. And women are told their bodies are unstable, hormonally unstable and messy and in need of regulation. There's literal bodily autonomy being stripped from people right now, all over the place. Then there are disability studies like Rosemary Garland Thompson, who kind of reminds us that disability is not a medical condition at all. It's actually a social construct. Disability became a problem only once society invented the idea of a normal body. Right? Industrial capitalism required like standardized workers and soldiers and students. So anyone who didn't fit those standards was marked as defective. And modern society still works this way. You know, public spaces are designed for able-bodied people. That's just how it is. Disabled people are excluded, right? They're stigmatized for not participating fully. And their existence becomes, at best, which is horrifying, some inspirational thing. Some way to fucking, get some money on GoFundMe. And they are like fetishized as this like inspiration. Like it's all about how it makes people feel to be nice to disabled people. It's fucking horrifying. Disability is actually, if you think about it, universal. If you live long enough, you're gonna get sick. Okay, that is just how it is. This brings us to the psychic level, because these ideals don't just shape policy or culture, they actually infiltrate our self-relation. So I want to talk a little bit about, psychoanalysis. So Freud showed how repression worked. We internalize the demands of authority until they become our superego. And health is the superego's best friend. It works the same way. So society doesn't need to police us directly, because we police ourselves. So counting calories, tracking steps, monitoring sleep, right? Feeling shame when our bodies don't conform. This is, the greatest tool of society. And Lacan sharpens this idea even more because he talks about the ideal, right? The ideal body that belongs to the imaginary, that's projected and reinforced by the symbolic order. So what we have then is the gaze of the other. So we end up comparing ourselves constantly to this fantasy image of health, which is unattainable by design. And the gap that is produced by this causes anxiety and guilt and obsession. And this damages our relationships with others. It strengthens our relationship to the symbolic order, but it damages the fuck out of our relationships with others. When I see myself only through categories like healthy and sick and fit and fat and able and disabled and addict, whatever, I approach others through those same filters. Love becomes impossible when it's mediated by health ideals, and desire collapses into standards. And the other is not seen as a subject, but as an object to be measured, judged, and corrected. But let's bring Stena in again. So Stena tells us that ideals enslave us. Health is one of the most seductive ideals because it disguises itself as self-care and care for others. So the healthy body or the productive mind or the normal human, these are spooks, okay? They live in our heads, direct our actions, and they alienate us from ourselves and from others. And to break the spook of health is not to reject medicine or therapy. This is super important. It's literally just to reject the idealization of health, to refuse to measure your body, your life, your relationships against the sacred standard. So in Stena's terms, your body is not for health. Your body is for you. Okay, your pain is yours. Your dependence is yours. Your death is yours. And in the next part, I want to look more into what it would mean to try and kind of escape that spook and to go further into vulnerability as a tool for liberation. So we've kind of traced how health became an ideal in an industry and a system of control. So let's kind of shift the lens, okay? Let's shift it inward, because these spooks don't just exist out there in institutions and industries. They actually kind of burrow into us, right? They shape how we see ourselves and how we see our bodies and how we love. So as I started talking about in the last segment, I want to look at Freud. So Freud reminds us that ideals become internal laws. So the superego isn't just your parents yelling at you, it's also the voice inside your head that's telling you to obey and to conform and to be good. So health has become one of those super egoic demands. Think about it. How much guilt do you carry around what you eat, how much you exercise, how much you sleep, how mentally healthy you are, how you, communicate efficiently, whatever. You feel shame not just when you're sick, but when you're not doing enough to be well. So what we can see here is that modern society has transformed health into a kind of morality. So you are good when you eat clean, when you go to therapy, when you meditate, when you journal. You're bad when you eat fast food, when you drink, when you skip your workout, when you do drugs, when you isolate, whatever. And this creates psychic damage. So Freud would call it repression. We split off the parts of ourselves that don't conform. We push down the messy, fragile, dependent parts in order to maintain the illusion of being a healthy subject. But the problem with repression is everything we repress is going to return, as Freud says, in much more destructive ways. And most of the time, those ways are outwardly destructive as well. So let's go into Lacan. He kind of takes this a little bit further, because for Lacan, our sense of self begins with the mirror stage. So we see our body reflected and we identify with that image. But the image is always an illusion. So it looks whole, but inside we feel fragmented. And, health works like that mirror. The healthy body is an image that we chase, right? Smooth skin, thin waist. And again, health as the ideal, which includes sex and not wanting to be ostracized and all this other bullshit, right? So it's not just about avoiding a cold, okay? It's about smooth skin. It's about thin waist, toned muscle, clear mind, whatever. We see it reflected in media, okay, in Instagram feeds and medical charts. So we try to match that, but we can't, because the image is unattainable by design. The ideal is unattainable by design. So we live in the gap between our lived fragile bodies and the fantasy of the ideal healthy body. So that gap produces anxiety and obsession and despair. But Lacan reminds us that the self is always divided, right? There's no perfect alignment between who we are and the images that we chase. And to believe otherwise is to kind of fall into the trap of the imaginary. So health in this sense is one giant imaginary trap. Then we have also the problem with other, right? Object. So let's talk about Melanie Klein's object relations. So her theory helps us see how this kind of plays out in relation to other people. Klein shows us that we split the world into good and bad objects as children. So mother is like in one way the nurturing and then in the other way the frustrating. So, later this kind of turns into a splitting that gets internalized and kind of produces moral categories of good and bad self. Like meaning, if I do this, then I get the good version. If I do this, then I get the bad version. So health ideals intensify this splitting because the healthy me is good. Disciplined, attractive, valuable, people like me, want me, whatever. The unhealthy me is bad, lazy, shameful, disgusting. So we oscillate between idealization and self-hatred, and we kind of never integrate the two in the way that we should, that would actually work and help us. And this damages our psychic wholeness in a sense. So we can't embrace ourselves as complex, vulnerable beings, and instead we live torn between the fit me and the failed me. Okay, now I want to think about how this isn't just an internal thing, it also leads to like an external thing. Like I already kind of mentioned with the whole, repression, what it does and how it affects other people. So these ideals don't just damage us internally. They distort how we relate to others. So if I see myself only through categories, like healthy, sick, fit, fat, addict, disabled, whatever, then I approach others through those same categories too. Relationships become exchanges of health capital in a sense. So are you a good partner? Are you stable? Are you fit? Are you productive? Are you attractive? Are you going to live a long life? Blah, blah, blah. You're going to be able to breed well. Okay. So love becomes conditional, transactional, filtered through the spook of health. And this is why love feels so impossible in modern society, I think, because we can't meet each other as vulnerable beings. We meet as performances and as profiles and as bodies that are ranked by desirability. One interesting perspective here is Martin Buber, who talks about the distinction between the I, it, and the I, thou, right? So most relationships in modern society are I, it. They are objectifications. We treat each other as objects, as things to use, measure, and categorize. But true relation, which is what he calls the I-thou, happens when we meet the other as subject and as mystery and as someone irreducible to categories. So health as an ideal, it blocks this. It blocks us from getting to that point. It reduces, just as any ideal, the other to an it, to a healthy body, an unhealthy body, a good partner, a bad partner, whatever. It makes love conditional on conformity. But when we accept vulnerability, when we see ourselves and others as fragile, dependent, and mortal, then an I-thou relationship becomes possible. So we meet each other not as images of health, but as beings in flux. And this is where Shanna becomes radical. Because Shanna doesn't ask us to overcome weakness, okay? Again, he asks us to own it. Own your vulnerability. The spook of health tells us that we have to be strong and independent and whole. And Shanna tells us, you are never going to be any of that shit. You're fragmented, you're fragile, and you're finite. So now own it and make it yours. To live in ownness is to stop pretending, okay? To stop repressing fragility, to say my pain is mine, my weakness is mine, my dependence is mine. And once you do that, there is a shift. Vulnerability stops being a threat and it becomes the basis for new forms of relation. Because when I own my limits, I no longer need to project them onto others. I no longer need to stigmatize and fetishize and police difference. I can just meet others as they are in their fragility and their messiness and their mortality, and that leads to connection. Relation becomes possible when we let go of the ideals and meet each other honestly. And here I want to also bring in Julia Kristeva. So Julia Kristeva has this very interesting book called Black Sun, where she describes depression as an encounter with emptiness, like a collapse of meaning and a confrontation with loss. But she also hints that depression can be generative. It can produce creativity and depth and new ways of seeing. So again, I want to ask the question now, what if these things that we try to kind of subdue or to make go away because we're afraid of, the end of our life, or to confront the idea of death, what if those things, pain, fragility, illness, instead of being things to hide, are actually sources of transformation if we look at them? What if the breakdown is not just failure but an opening? And of course, this is something that happens to people who are sick. They're kind of forced into that understanding. But what if you could just reframe how you look at your own body? What if you could reframe how you look at your own kind of physical existence and your mental existence through your body? Modern society tells us to avoid this breakdown at all costs. Medicate, cope, keep functioning. Focus on something else, something else, something else. But sometimes this collapse is the only honest thing. Sometimes it's what allows a new relation to yourself to emerge. Lacan once said, "Love is giving what you do not have." That is the essence of vulnerability. Love is not about presenting yourself as whole and healthy and desirable. It's about exposing the lack and the crack in the limit. And modern society fucking hates this. It wants love to be about optimization, right? The fit couple, the power couple, the mentally healthy couple. But that is not love. It's fucking co-branding, man. Love in Ownness is different. It's not about hiding weakness, but sharing weakness. Not about presenting yourself as healthy, but about being present in your fragility. So when I love you, I don't love your health. I don't love your image. I love you in your weakness and your mortality and your pain. And you love me in mine. And that is love stripped of spooks. So let's summarize. What does it mean to live in ownness against the spook of health? It doesn't mean rejecting medicine, obviously, or wellness. It really doesn't, okay? I don't want to hear these fucking comments about, why should I just fucking stop working out? Should I just become a fat fuck? No, nobody said that, okay? Calm the fuck down. It doesn't mean glorifying sickness, okay? It means refusing to bow before health as an idol. It means treating every category, sick, healthy, fat, thin, disabled, addict, as tools, not truths. It means allowing yourself to break down, to feel pain, and to be fragile without shame. It means building relationships that are not about the exchange of health capital, but about vulnerability and honesty. It means looking at your body and saying, this is mine, not yours, not society's, not the state's, not the wellness industries. It's mine. And maybe it means that love, empathy, and connection can actually fucking emerge for once. Not through the fantasy of health, but through the reality of weakness. Because when we stop pretending to be invulnerable, we can finally meet each other as we are. And that, in my opinion, is more powerful than any health ideal could ever be. For today's spotlight, I want to turn to an essay that was written by Julian Langer titled The Unique and Their Diseases. It was published last week in our e-zine, The Creative Nothing. It begins with a passage from Max Schener's The Unique and Its Property. The opposition between the real and the ideal is an irreconcilable one, and the one can never become the other. If the ideal became the real, it would no longer be the ideal. If the real became the ideal, there would only be the ideal, and the real wouldn't be at all. I am the owner of my power, and I am so when I know myself as unique. So, Langer takes this insight, the irreconcilability of the real and the ideal, and filters it through the rawest of experiences, like living with chronic illness, fatigue, surgeries, and pain that pushes the body to the threshold of survivability. So this essay is a reflection on illness, right? But it's also a reflection on individuality and what it means to live outside the spook of health. So essentially, this is about the phenomenology of illness to kind of expose the absurdity of it. I want to now offer an interview with Julian that I conducted yesterday. Briefly, unfortunately, I was kind of interrupted, but it happens. So for today's spotlight, we're going to be looking at uniqueness through the lens of philosophy and bringing in illness. And so I'm going to bring in the voice of somebody who has explored these questions in a raw, lived, and radically individualist way. So let me tell you a little bit about Julian. Julian is a philosopher, writer, and activist whose work moves between ontological anarchism, environmental thought, feral philosophy, and eco-absurdist rebellion. He's the author of several books, including Revolting, Eco-Absurdist Rebellion, along with poetry collections, short stories, and countless essays that kind of grapple with the question of how to live and affirm life amidst ecological collapse and mass extinction, and just generally like the suffocating structures around us. I don't want to say too much. I'm just gonna kind of lead right into it. I am not sure about the actual quality of the recording, but I did my best, friends, so stick with me. Here we go. Here's the interview with Julian Langer. All right. So first of all, hello. It's really nice to meet you. Nice to talk to you. I really enjoyed your essay. I thought it was super interesting. I'm a big fan of personal essays in general, so I enjoyed that. I hope that you saw that I actually reviewed it in a newsletter. I'm not sure if you saw that, but yeah, I really enjoyed it. So thanks so much for doing this interview. I really want to bring more interviews into the podcast, so this is kind of really helpful. So I want to start by giving the listeners and the readers like a sense of you as a person and a thinker. Can you talk a little bit just about who you are, what you do, what you're passionate about, and what you're working on at the moment?
Wow. That's a lot to try and answer. And I guess there's a degree to which I don't know if I can answer that. If it's, you know, in the sense of me kind of saying who I am, who am I? Uh, I guess the what comes to me is something that I'm someone who is doing their best to embrace this experience of life, and kind of say to life in an active and creative and, you know, caring manner, and with that something of someone who lives a bit of existential crisis, or let's say bit, who lives an existential crisis, um, and who favors acorns and badger cubs over political systems, and who just wants to experience something of a healthy or healthier, whatever that means, whatever that feels like, world, I guess. I don't know. I don't know if that meets your questions fully or at least partially. Yeah, that's what comes to me now anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think a lot of people would actually probably have a hard time with that question. And, I think the whole existential crisis thing is, yeah, in one way or another, something that a lot of people can relate to, I think. So yeah, thanks for that answer. It's actually, I would say, a lot more informative than maybe you're thinking right now. Um, okay, so maybe let's just get right into the essay, and kind of, yeah, maybe just talk about for the people that like haven't read it, what it's about, and maybe how you came to write about it. Um, yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, sure. Happy to go straight into the essay. Um, so the focus of the essay is the experience of illness, and with that, something of the experience of pain or disease or dis-ease, um, which has been a significant part of my life experience as someone who is relatively young, who has gone through the experience of brain tumor treatment in my late teens and early 20s. And then over the last nearly 2 years, dealing with an ocular tumor and the impacts of the ocular tumor on my health, and how that relates to my experience of individuality and individuation, as kind of physical embodiment. You could say something of a kind of Nietzschean return to the flesh, though I do cringe at calling myself Nietzschean, because there's, to paraphrase Nietzsche, there was only ever one Nietzschean and he died on his cross. Um, uh, so yeah, I think that's fair to say that that's the focus is on what it's like to feel certain diseases and how that relates to the experience of being individuated bodily, um, and particularly how that can relate to um, experiences and difference of perception and perspective. Um, so, like, two of the personal examples that I use that I do somewhat joke about, is that I have a thing called vertical gaze palsy, um, which is related to something called dorsal midbrain syndrome. Um, and the thing with vertical gaze palsy is that I can't look up properly. I I have to move my head up physically to be able to look up. Like, my eyes only go so far in the socket. Um, and the other thing is that following the removal of the ocular tumor, which while it was there was impacting my color vision, which has improved since, but since it was removed, I have increased light sensitivity, which, as with these two things, can't look up, sensitive to light. As someone who is a self-described pessimist, that is fucking hilarious. Really, like, kind of fuck you God sense of hilarious. And true. So yeah, there's something of that in the essay. And in terms of what brought me to writing it, was just, I think there's something something of, there is a therapeutic quality to writing, and articulating experience and those sorts of ways, which is healing and helpful. And then there's also a degree to which um, I would put this in kind of quite strongly in the aestheticism of, I wrote the piece to write the piece, and anyone finds resonance with it, or finds it helpful for them, that's wonderful. I didn't write it to do something. In the sense of, it's not got a higher purpose or some cause behind it. Yeah, and with that is part of my personal revolt. But yeah, I hope that meets your question.
So, first of all, anything that you say is going to meet my question. So, just I just want to hear from you. I want to hear about your perspective. So, I thought that in your essay, it was really kind of interesting how you approached ideas like the body with this like sense of vulnerability. Like I'm a very like I'm a the kind of person who, when I read something, I'm like drawn to not just like what is being said, but how it's being said, because I come from like a literary background. And I thought that, and I think a lot about vulnerability in writing. And I thought it was interesting how you seemed to connect the vulnerability of writing with, the body, and then ideas like freedom and will. And I was wondering, just out of pure personal interest, if you could talk a little bit more about that. And, maybe that's a little bit like too maybe selfish of a question also, but I am very interested in vulnerability, and I'm very interested in yeah, the like you said, like therapeutic sort of value of this vulnerable kind of expression. So yeah, if this is not too much of a, ridiculously silly question, maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah, that's yeah, I'm happy to meet on that kind of level. Because that is a thing when we talk about will, and when we kind of use these kind of, perhaps, yeah, again, to use the term Nietzschean type of thought, it's often put as something of might. And when we think of force, we think of force as something that is like aggressive or abusive, or something of violating. We think of power, we think of domination, and those things can refer to those. That can be what we're talking about. And then some of the things that have really always felt kind of attractive to me in terms of thought and in terms of approaches to writing and approaches to praxis, is this thing of authenticity and being real. and honest and sincere. And part of that involves doing that thing of being vulnerable and being honest about ourselves. And there is a force to that. There is a power. There is a might in the vulnerability. There is, and in the honesty. And there's also something freeing, certainly in the sense of freeing, for me, freeing myself from the harms of male socialization, which is something I wrote a little bit about in my book Revolting, where it's like these things of, being vulnerable and being honest in ways that those of us who experience male socialization are extremely discouraged from being, with the encouragement of man up, and all that goes with that, and that kind of ingraining of that internal script of, boys don't cry, and it's like, okay, and there is a force and a might that is that kind of abusive, self-abusive even, kind of thing of like, no, I won't share the difficulty, I won't share the pain, I won't acknowledge it. I'm numb. That is a force, but it's not necessarily one that I find desirable. And there is a power in vulnerability, and that power is, first thing, it's a power in being able to recognize our own needs. So if I'm really vulnerable with myself, I really connect with what I'm needing. If I'm not shying away from my feelings, I'm really, really experiencing them. So I experience the pain. Just because, that really hurts. What am I needing with that? And that's difficult, but it's freeing in its own way. And then there's the power of vulnerability in being with, and an individuality and individuation only really makes sense to me with being with as well. And so there's something of, if someone's being vulnerable with me, then that allows me to be able to, it enables me and empowers me to be able to meet them in a way that is helpful, in a way that means that we can coexist together in a way that is not harming each other. I can support them in their needs, and then if I'm able to be vulnerable with them, they can support me with my needs as well. And so there's a thing of, in terms of what we talk about in anarchist conversations, about this thing of mutual aid. It's a way of both of us being able to mutually support each other. That's freeing. Certainly, to my experience, that's freeing. So yeah, and so there is a deliberate choice to kind of write and speak in these ways, or it is doing that thing of being honest, which is kind of radically different from that thing that often gets called individualism or rugged individualism, which has, in my belief, nothing to do with actual authentic individualism, and makes talking about this really challenging at points with the people who really also find that thing of rugged individualism horrific and desperate to be as different from that as they can be, which then can pose its own issues sometimes. But yeah, there's there's a lot to be said for vulnerability and what it can bring.
I couldn't agree more. Like, I think about this all the time. And I think this is often a theme that I discuss on the podcast. So I appreciate that I got somebody kind of, you know, uh, feeling the same way and backing me up. um, so I guess I want to ask you, if do you feel that your experience of illness has helped you in a way, kind of, maybe, I don't know, get closer to your own sense of vulnerability, or allow for that vulnerability in yourself and in relationships with others? Do you feel that maybe it's almost helped you in kind of getting, I don't know, I guess more in like a close connection with yourself, if you could say it like that, like understanding your own needs maybe? So I guess my question is just like, how has illness shaped your experience of yourself and others?
Yeah, I think that it's fair to say that it's been very helpful in my ability to do that. There's a kind of certain brutal quality or harsh quality to um, that thing of, you know, you're going through an illness like a brain tumor, you kind of need to be real about certain things and honest about certain things, that with those who are looking to support you and care for you, if you're going to survive that. Um, and that's a difficult and a painful thing to go through, but it's certainly been helpful for me. And it's also, whilst there is that kind of brutal quality of, you know, which is on like the level of kind of what you could say is like piss, shit, and vomit, um, uh, and kind of that real yucky stuff side of things. Um, the blood and guts. um, there's also this kind of this being able to be loved, experience being loved, which again, going back to like male socialization, which I know is something that you've spoken about on your podcast. And I appreciated your episode on gender. That was really, really well done. That whole thing about being able to be loved and have that experience of being loved, in a real and vulnerable sense, not in the kind of not in a performative sense, but in a sense of real intimacy and real being with. That's wonderfully healing, and and something that is it going, being loved in the context of absolutely terrible physical experiences, and experiencing that kind of that tenderness is wonderful. And I wrote about that in a piece several years ago on titled Cancer, Technology, and a Visceral, Ineffable Experience, I think is the title. Yeah, for sure, in response to your question.
Yeah, I will link your books and maybe just your website in the description so people can engage more with your work if they haven't already. So now I just want to briefly ask you about a line that I really liked in your essay, which is all ideals are meaningless nonsense before the matters of health, illness, and the possibility of death. It's obviously like a really cutting line. It's kind of like, in my opinion, like the most, just like this is what it is kind of line. Yeah, I guess I just want to ask you like how you kind of arrived at that conclusion and how maybe you see your own physical experience as like a revolt, and whether you think that this is something that maybe others can also apply to their own life, to their own approach to living, even if they're not maybe going through intense illness, but also just in general to get more in touch with their own body and yeah, how that can maybe help people on their way.
So, trying to meet all aspects of what you just kind of asked. I'll start with the kind of perhaps the non-duality of body and revolt. There's a kind of existential truth I believe in, which is that our bodies are kind of continually engaged in that kind of will to life, that is like the will to overcome illness and disease, and with that there's something of resistance towards death, and so there's that existential revolt, and then our bodies are ecologically situated in the within wherever we are, and so there's an ecological quality to that revolt as well, as we seek to resist that which would harm us or perhaps bring about our deaths, and so there's that, and that's regardless of whether or not you're going through a tumor or some other like life-altering illness. There's something, I believe, that's, if there's any kind of like universal quality to being alive, and I say that I don't believe in universal qualities, but it's the word that's going to work best for here. If there is a universal, and it's not universal, but like there's always difference and differentiation. There's something of that kind of, living beings are, for the most part, oriented towards something of a refusal of death, which is absurd, obviously, because we all die. And that's kind of true whatever our experience of health is, whether or not that involves life-altering or significant illness or disease. My instinct is that within the context of living within civilization, or you call it the state or Leviathan or whatever you want, there's something of a kind of, there's a health struggle that comes, even that's mental health, like psychological well-being, or whether or not that's, with regards to illness or disease, there's something of a struggle that goes on with that. As this culture is not good for our health, and you can point to people like Freud, who was writing about civilization being not good for you in a mental health sense. Like he rooted neuroses in civilization, to use his language. I prefer writers like Nick Totten, who write about that. And then there's also Edward Carpenter and others who have written about just civilization just being bad for our health. It's the these kind of spread of disease is rampant with urbanization, and that kind of massification and collectivization. So there's something there which feels, my instinct is that everyone will have an experience of health concern to some degree, whether or not that's for them personally or from someone who they are with, someone who they love. And then that thing of the ideal, health matters kind of cutting through the ideal. I think is that a conclusion? Probably is a conclusion, though I feel reluctant to call it a conclusion. I don't like the idea of concluded thoughts. It's that creative nothing thing. Everything is in a thing of becoming. It might be concluded for the moment, but it might also grow into something new. And the sense of conclusion is a death, the conclusion of the thought. Without death, we might have a new thought grow. Sorry, just got a bit distracted there. There's something there of, so for myself, there's the ideal of what life I'd imagined myself having, the activities I wanted to do, that just being destroyed by illness. And I think that it does that. Things like, you can't, regardless of how perfect your utopian society is, if there's a matter of plague, you've got to deal with that before you can do anything of trying to construct your ideal. Like, it's meaningless before this matter of plague. On a more personal level, like, doesn't matter what you want for yourself, you can't get past a disease or an illness or something that is there and going to get in the way of that. And that is a harsh and horrible truth, but it is true. And this is for me kind of where I in a major way kind of detract from Lacan and Lacanian thinking, and I'm aware that you're quite into Lacan. Now, I don't believe the real is impossible. I believe the real is not just possible; it's here, and while it might be inarticulable, and have a kind of ineffable mystical quality about it, and be in that mysticism, it being awe-inspiring in the sense of awful disease, illness is real, and destroys the ideal. Much the same way ecological ill health, which is largely what global warming is, certainly in my eyes, pertains to something of this real that's just is destroying political ideals and kind of fantasies and dreams about organizations and orientations of society. So yeah, I hope that.
Yeah, actually, I'm very much with you on the real. So while I love Lacan, like in an analytical sense, I definitely think the real is a possibility. Yeah, thank you for that. That was actually really interesting. I don't know if you can hear it, but it's getting really loud here in the background. I have to re-record a couple of times. There's like kids playing soccer and, you know. Anyways, I want to kind of, or I don't want to, but I kind of have to end the conversation here. I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for taking the time to do this. Like I said, I really liked your essay. I encourage everybody who listens to my podcast to read it. I think it's very insightful. And yeah, if there's anything that you would like to share still that you have left to talk about, please do. And yeah, stay in contact. Let's, talk again. You have my number now. So if you ever want to chat, let's do that. And yeah, I hope you have a really nice day.
Hey, thank you for inviting me to be on your podcast, and yeah, it's been good. All the best.
All right, friends. Thank you for listening to the episode of the Spookcast. If you want more of this work, egoism, psychoanalysis, spook hunting type stuff, there are a few ways to dive deeper. I publish The Creative Nothing, which is an e-zine dedicated to tearing apart the illusions that kind of shape us. I post one new essay every week on Substack, Recurring Paradox, and I also share my videos, obviously, on my YouTube channel, sometimes more than just the podcast episode, but right now I'm kind of busy, so I'm only posting once a week. You can also follow me on social media. Obviously, I post a lot of shorts there and just general information about what's going on. So yeah, if this episode resonated with you, subscribe to the Spookcast and share it with someone else who might need a little spook exorcism in their life. Also, everything will be linked in the description. You can find Julian's other writings there as well, his website. Yeah, until next time, remember not to let the spooks get you.